Let's go.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Zephyr's Adjusted for Risk podcast from the shores of Lake Tahoe. Gold's fantastic run in 2025 has put the spotlight on commodities, real assets, and precious metals. Well, there is a subset of metals, rare earth metals, that is also gaining in popularity as they are essential for many consumer tech products that we use every day. Well, I'm very excited about today's show as we have on a very special guest who is an industry expert in rare earth minerals. But first, today's episode is sponsored by the award winning Zephyr, which helps investment professionals make more informed investment decisions on behalf of their clients. I'd like to give a very warm welcome to Andrew Musgraves. Andrew is a senior product manager at Van Eck. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on. It's an honor to have you on. Really excited about this conversation. It's going to be a fun one. Can you please tell us a little bit more about yourself and Van Eck?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ryan. Excited to be on as well. Senior product manager at Van Eck. I've been here for the last 17 years or so. I've spent my career around resource equities, commodities, and real asset strategies. And rare earths are just one of these interesting areas to me because they're at the corner of sort of the market where there's a bunch of intersecting themes, right? National security, energy transition, all the powerful technologies that we use every day. So that's why it's an interesting topic for me. And Van Eck, of course, has been a thought leader in this space for a very long time and in resource equities broadly, pioneering many areas, including in gold and natural resources, commodities. It launched one of the first gold mining mutual funds back in the late 1960s, one of the first gold mining ETFs in 2006. So really recognizing trends early on, approaching the market in a very forward-looking manner. And yeah, today over 50 billion in assets tied to gold equities, natural resources, and commodities. So excited to talk about this.
Yeah, fantastic, Andrew. Yeah, a lot of experience there. You have a lot of experience, so it's going to be a fun conversation. I just want to make sure that you're not going to question me about the periodic table as we're talking about minerals and elements and stuff like that. And we want to get that out front.
Of course.
Okay, good, because I'm pretty sure I might have failed biology back in the day. Good to know. Let's just start. I feel like most people know the precious metals asset class, such as gold and silver and copper, but less may know about strategic metals, and then probably even less may know about rare earth metals. Let's start by explaining what's the difference between rare earth metals, strategic metals, and then even precious metals.
Yeah, sure. When we think about precious metals, we think mostly about gold and silver, the like. Silver does have some industrial applications, but predominantly when we think about gold and silver, we tend to think about them as storeholds of wealth. Um, Rare earths, strategic metals, lots of industrial application. Rare earths are actually 17 metals. They're separated at the bottom of the periodic table. I won't mention any more than that, but with names like neodymium and praseodymium and terbium, not names that you'd hear at a local hardware store, but these are important metals nonetheless. And they're not even really that hard to find rare in the Earth's crust. They're just economically challenging to extract and process at scale. They require a lot of complex and environmentally sensitive refining processes, but they're often referred to as the hidden backbone of modern technology. They're really critical inputs into a lot of the key future enabling technologies in consumer electronics, industrials, defense, and even healthcare. They're known for their unique traits and things like magnetism, heat resistance, which makes them really good for sort of strong magnets. And per ounce, it's really just challenging to replicate the efficiency that they bring to many of these technologies. And then strategic metals, it's not a real standardized list. It varies by government and regulatory agency based on their strategic needs in terms of industrial production or defense. But most lists typically include things like lithium or cobalt or titanium or tungsten. Again, it's a pretty broad range in terms of their uses, but they're heavily relied on for the same things, these clean energy technologies, industrial applications. So those are the main differences between all of those.
That was perfect, Andrew. I like how you had mentioned your that when we talk about in the investment space and portfolio management, we talk about gold and silver because, like you said, it's this store of value. It's a good hedge to inflation. So that's easy to put our arms around. But though, then I love how you said then rare earth metals, it's more of the industrial application for metals compared to gold and silver. A great way to make it easy to understand, especially for somebody like me. So, why invest though in rare earth metals versus other well known metals like gold or lithium?
Yeah, sure. When we talk about investing in rare or earths versus things like precious metals again are really much more of a storehold of wealth, right? You're going to use it for protection against things like de-dollarization or severe inflation. But with rare earths and strategic metals, it's more of a thematic play on some of the things that we touched on at the very outset there, which is like national security, energy transition, kind of some of these advanced technologies. So that's really why you would consider rare earths in addition to maybe an allocation that you have to something like precious metals.
So, would you say then there's not a whole lot of correlation between the two of them, too? So, like you said, you can invest in both and not have a overly correlated alternative sleeve or real asset sleeve, then?
Yeah, exactly. So there is a low correlation between those particular assets. And we would view rare earths as really something that kind of fits within a broader resource equity allocation, maybe as part of a real asset sleeve. They do all have the same rationale for investing. When we think about resource equities more broadly, we really are concerned about things like inflation protection, leverage to global growth. We're worried about things like portfolio diversification, a hedge against geopolitical risk, and rare earths kind of actually fit all of these as gold too. Certainly for rare earths, right? It protects against dramatically rising underlying commodity prices. It provides a lot of leverage to many of these kind of associated themes that we're talking about in advanced technologies and national defense and energy transition. It's certainly a portfolio diversifier, practically uncorrelated returns with the broader US equity markets, and a hedge against geopolitical risk in that it actually benefits from these rising US China trade tensions that we may see. I think that they all deserve a place in a portfolio and can have their own sleeves within a real assets allocation.
Yeah, that's interesting. And we're going to touch on this here shortly and dig a little bit deeper in the role they have in investment portfolios. Let's go back to what are the primary drivers of rare earth metals in that market? You mentioned geopolitical tensions. Are there any other drivers there that investors should be aware of?
Yeah, really, it comes down to supply and demand, like for most commodity markets. So, certainly, rare earths is no different in this case. It has a lot to do with the demand drivers and the supply as well. In terms of demand, actually, really, rare earths and strategic metals, it's clean energy that dominates sort of the demand picture. It's around 35% of rare earth demand. Highest is consumer electronics at around 21%, industrial automation around 16, and then aerospace and defense somewhere around 13, healthcare, other industries below that. And then really when we think about their end use in terms of clean energy, it's things like wind turbines and electric vehicles and grid scale batteries, even nuclear reactors. On the consumer electronics side, it's flat screen TVs and monitors, cell phones, headphones, and healthcare. It's MRI machines and diagnostic systems. And in aerospace and defense, it's jet engines, drones, optics, guidance systems, things like that. A stat that we like to throw out every once in a while is that an F 35 contains over 900 pounds of rare earths, and a Virginia class submarine contains about 9,200 pounds of rare earth. As you see, sort of the demand for these technologies and systems go, so do rare earths. And they're there to improve efficiency and performance across these technologies. And then, of course, we have supply issues as well, which I'm happy to jump into at some point.
Yeah, we'll talk about that next. And it's just interesting when you talk about when you look like a F-16 or fighter jet, you very rarely just think of, or even an iPhone or some technology, really what goes into creating it and the minerals that are needed or required to. So it's really interesting you say that how much really goes into a fighter jet, and without these rare earth minerals, where would we be with defense? So great insight there. So let's talk about supply. What to me, rare earth, is there a limited supply? Where is that supply coming from? It seems like maybe it's a little rare,
Yeah.
shall we say.
So actually, as we pointed out earlier, they're actually not all that rare in the earth. It's just a matter of extracting these materials at scale and doing it economically. There's actually just very few countries where countries and companies are doing this at scale and economically. And the majority of that happens to actually just be in China. It dominates the supply and processing for a broad range of the rare earth and strategic metals. And outside that, really the options are limited. Even the US, which kind of accounts for a growing portion of the rare earth supply these days at around 11%, still relies on China very heavily for processing. China, I think, is around 90% of the for rare earths. And the other thing is to consider as far as supply is just how long it takes to bring on new supply. Like the timelines for building these mines can be a decade plus. Just for some context, the total supply of rare earths amounts to basically just a mere fraction of that of other metals, right? So copper markets, for example, are about 60 times larger. Iron ore markets are about 7,500 times larger. So it's a very small market, but it's just critical in terms of its end use for all the things that we spoke about earlier, all the applications that it had. And yeah, China just accounts for a vast majority of that supply. They also account for a majority of the world's known reserves as well, at around approximately 44 metric tons, the next closest being Vietnam and Brazil. Just speaking very briefly about the time that it takes to bring on new supply, because it's an important point, is that it can vary between project scope and size, but you're generally talking anywhere from between 10 to 15 years to bring on this new supply, from early exploration to permitting and construction and ramping up production. It can take a decade, half a 2 decades or more in some cases, depending on the location. So it's just unlikely that you're able to bring on new supply very rapidly. And strategic metals, the lead times are a little bit different, but it's still very difficult to just establish a mine and bring it up to speed right away. And certainly a consideration when you're talking about supplying markets.
Yeah, interesting. And let's go back to what you say. China is a huge player, like you said. It produces about what 90% of rare earths. First thing you got to think about when you think of China and that relationship is geopolitics and policy. We all know that it's a touch and go, touchy subject with the relationships with China and those tensions. What impact does policy have on markets for rare earth metals? And I'm sure it's a huge impact policy has, and it probably plays a big role in that 10 to 15 years of supply too. It takes to get to market.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been a very big subject this year and right now, because if you think about China, they've dominated this market. And so they're able to use these minerals as a geopolitical currency, similar to how other nations might have used oil historically. So they'll tend to deploy export controls during these periods of strategic tension. They did this previously in 2010 with rare earths, and they were demonstrating their willingness to weaponize supply. And they did it here again in 2025. They tightened supply. You saw this tripling in rare earth price, underlying rare earth prices. They just show that they can disrupt the defense and clean energy sectors really with minimal policy change. One thing I guess I would just point out really quickly about China, maybe before we get into what other countries are doing to address China, is that China didn't really get there overnight, right? They built this dominance through sort of long term centralization and state coordination. They took a bunch of their mines and consolidated them into these sort of large state-owned enterprises, controlled production quotas and pricing to help shape the market, moved into sort of vertically integrated mining and refining to magnet production, and using a bunch of subsidies to subsidize all of these activities. And so that sort of allowed them, in combination with having looser environmental regulations, to really dominate this market. Just something that I'd like to mention where we talked about policy otherwise, but to consider certainly as far as China is concerned.
Y- Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. And you mentioned too what other countries are doing to hedge against the control China has and how dominant they are in this space. What are other countries doing? I'm sure, especially with clean energy, we all know how European countries are really going all in on clean energy. So I'm sure they are doing some different things to hedge against China as compared to maybe the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. China has the upper hand. What are other countries doing to combat this? And it's mobilizing a lot of other countries right now and governments to try and step up their supply chains outside of China. So the EU, US, Australia are leading the way in terms of this effort, but it's much more broad and meaningful than it has been in the past. So just this year in North America, the Department of Defense or Department of War made a preferred equity investment and offtake agreement with a company here called MP Materials. And the whole idea behind that was to create this first fully integrated mine to magnet supply chain in North America. Apple, right? So you're seeing corporate jump in as well, signed a multi-year offtake commitment with MP Materials to sourcing their magnet supplies domestically. And yeah, Department of Defense grants to Linus Rare Earths for heavy and light rare earth separation, Department of Energy extending loans to Lithium Americas. So, US really leading the way in terms of direct investment into some of these companies. EU's taking a broader approach, right? They have this Critical Raw Minerals Act, and it provides this sort of regulatory framework for domestic production and supported by a bunch of subsidies and funding projects in places like France and Estonia and Germany. Yeah. Supply chains is more important now so than ever in the past. And I guess the question is really will this be enough to move the needle? Too early to tell, but it's encouraging tailwinds for the space nonetheless to see this.
Yeah, very good information and insight there, Andrew. And it makes sense that countries like the U.S. are investing in companies within the U.S. to try and offset the reliance on China. Makes complete sense there. Let's go back to you touched on it earlier about investing and what role rare earth metals have on investment portfolios. You talked about diversification. Obviously, you just talked about geopolitical issues and the tensions there, and rare earth metals might be a good hedge to geopolitical tensions on the rise there. Are there any other impacts rare earths have on investment portfolios?
No, we really covered the ones that I think that I would touch on here again when we think about the core rationale for resource equities, which rare earths and strategic metals are a part of. We think of inflation protection, leverage to global growth, portfolio diversification, and a hedge against geopolitical risk. And rare earths and strategic metals really fit all of those parameters in our minds. I think the only other thing that I would just mention with respects to rare earths and strategic metals was just the volatility of the asset class. Obviously, it's an extremely volatile asset class. It's about 3 times the historical volatility of the S&P 500. And the landscape can change rapidly. It happened in 2010, 2011, 2012 when China reversed some of its policy and we saw a whipsaw in prices. And in 2020 to 2022, there was a perceived lithium supply squeeze. Things turned into oversupply very quickly and prices collapsed. So I think investors should just be aware of this whenever they're sizing their position in rare earths. That if you're trying to size your resource equity or real asset sleeve to something like 5 to 10% of your portfolio, which is what we typically suggest, you're probably thinking something more along the lines of a 1 to 2% position size in terms of rare earths or strategic metals.
Does that volatility you mentioned, obviously supply and demand, you said that it's a primary driver. But when you talked about volatility, does that mostly come from geopolitical tensions and just what's going on with China? And is that why it's so volatile?
Yeah, a large part of it in this case, again, if we think back to 2010, there was some conflict between China and Japan. They quickly moved to implement tightening of exports, and that caused prices to shoot right up. And again, we saw something similar, as I noted, with the supply squeeze in lithium, which made lithium prices go through the roof. And yeah, again, we saw this in 2025, increasing trade tensions. China moves to implement export restrictions, and again, we see these prices move. So much more often, you're seeing it typically move with these types of geopolitical scenarios, these geopolitical tensions, but it can also be a demand driven factor. 2022, when you saw lithium demand shoot through the roof for perceived need for EVs, that was a demand driven factor, less so with geopolitical tensions than it was a demand driven factor.
Interesting. So you mentioned the role they play in investment portfolios, diversifier can be a good hedge to issues out there. So when you look at overall portfolio, would you, as a financial advisor, would you maybe take a portion of your alternative sleeve, or just if you want real assets, put this in your real asset sleeve? Where do rare earths really sit in a portfolio? Do you have any thoughts or tips to financial advisors there?
Yeah, I would say in cases when we've seen financial advisors put some money to work in this space, they're typically pulling this from pre-existing real assets allocation. If they didn't have a pre-existing real assets allocation, it might become part of a smaller portion of their equity portfolio. But again, sized to risk, a 1 to 2% position from their overall core equity, really not looking to get much bigger than that, just given the volatility of the space.
Yeah, very good point. And as we all know, you got to know your client and their risk tolerance and investment objectives. So, have to throw that out there, even though everyone knows it. So, lastly, financial advisors, they are listeners. They find what you had to say very interesting. How can financial advisors incorporate rare earth metals in their clients' portfolios? Where do they start if they want to get some exposure?
Yeah, sure. So the one thing about rare earths and strategic metals is that they aren't really traded on exchanges, much like some of the precious metals that we spoke about earlier. There just aren't futures markets for these particular commodities, or at least liquid enough futures
Mm-hmm.
markets. So it really makes equities the only practical access route in this case. And VanEck has a product, the VanEck Rare Earths and Strategic Metals ETF, ticker REMX, which provides this sort of liquid, pure play exposure to rare earths and strategic metals. It's a passively managed ETF, so it's designed to track the MVIS Global Rare Earth and Strategic Metals Index, but the index is, in our view, pretty intelligently designed. Yeah, it's a pure play index with a focus on companies generating majority of their revenue, at least 50% from the production, refining, recycling of rare earths and strategic metals. And just given the relatively small universe of investable names, focusing on size and liquidity requirements, it's a good index, and we think probably the best way for investors to try and access this theme today.
Andrew, thank you so much. A fantastic conversation. I love these conversations about the investments or strategies that, bringing exposure to them, insight to them that really can be impactful to an investment portfolio that otherwise you may not know much about. You might read it in a headline, but you need so much more information. So thank you, Andrew. And also, Thank you so much for not questioning me about my knowledge of the periodic table. I appreciate it taking it easy on me. So fantastic. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can our listeners get more information about Van Eck?
Yeah, sure. You can visit vaneck.com, and there we have a bunch of information, including white papers, videos, anything that you need. It's a great resource for any of our materials. So
Yeah, I second that. It may, for some, they may question this, but I do a little bit of research before these interviews and conversations. Went to Van Eck. You guys have a lot of great, and you're the author of a lot of it on rare earth minerals and just information about the asset class and investing in it. So I can't recommend that enough. So great stuff. And thank you everyone for listening to this episode of Zephyr's Adjusted for Risk podcast. You can watch all of our other podcasts on the Zephyr YouTube channel, as well as on Spotify. And please be sure to like and follow those channels and subscribe to our LinkedIn page. Thank you and have a great rest of your week.
thank you.